Hi there, it's Kevin with the Rogue Market here with 10 cards that are interesting specs because they pair very well with cards that are coming out of Modern Horizons. Now, this isn't in any order, isn't a top 10 list. It's just 10 cards that I've come up with after looking at the spoilers from yesterday, today. I even have a few of the ones earlier on the week that have really good pairings with cards that already exist and could spike up. If you've noticed, there have been many cards like Sliver Hive that have doubled up in value, Auntie's Hovel, a lot of these synergistic cards between cards that are coming out from Modern Horizons. There are a few that I think are lagging behind, and that's what this list is mainly focused on. There's a lot of what ifs, there's a lot of unknowns, and just take that with a grain of salt here, so that this isn't a definite. So anyway, let's just start with the list. Aren't in any particular order. It's just 10 synergies I've found with these cards. So the first one is Goblin Matron. This has been a legacy card, has been a popper card for quite some time. And one of the favorite targets for Goblin Matron to pick up is the Bushwhacker. So the Reckless Bushwhacker or the Goblin Bushwhacker are very, very popular cards for the Matron to pick up, especially if you can reduce the cost of goblins. Then in the same turn, you can easily cast a Matron and a Bushwhacker on turn 4 or turn 5 a lot of the times, and it can just be lethal at that point. So I'm thinking that the Matron is exactly what Goblins needs for Modern to kind of push it into, not tier 1 or tier 2, but at least put it back on the scene. Goblins is a viable deck. It just struggles versus some of the other creature combo based decks like humans at the moment. Just have a very good matchup versus goblins. And I think though, if the format goes back to a 1-for-1 format where go wide is a viable strategy, goblins is one of the better go wide aggro decks in Modern. So it might breathe some new life into it. And Goblin Bush for the Goblin Matron, I like both the Reckless Bushwhacker and the Goblin Bushwhacker. Next up, we have Fluster Storm. Fluster Storm has caused a few people think that finally Nigmagus Elemental is viable. So there have been some decent Storm cards for Nigmagus Elemental to eat, but none of them have been as cheap as Fluster Storm. Fluster Storm, you could even target a spell that you don't even care about countering, and then just eat all the Storm copies and the Fluster Storm to increase the power and toughness of the Nigmagus Elemental. So Nigmagus Elemental says exile an instant or sorcery spell. You control and put 2+1/+1 counters on Nigmagus Elemental. This is already being bought up like crazy on TCG Player. If you actually look, it was the most purchased card on TCG Player, not standard. So War of the Spark is still selling a ton of cards on TCG Player. This is like the next one that is being sold. So Nigmagus Elemental, people specking this all the time. I've seen some successful decks in the past, but nothing's ever really stayed around for this card. But it is interesting enough. It's definitely a cool little combo with Fluster Storm and any other cards that might be printed with the Storm count. On it to two cards that I like are the Lightning Skelemental. Of course, people have talked about Bloodbraid Elf being paired with the Lightning Skelemental. People are also calling this the Ball of Blightning. I can't remember what Ball of Blightning is the nickname for the Lightning Skelemental. As it's a 6/1 trample haste, they discard a card if it connects, or discard 2 cards if it connects. So things that cascade into it are pretty decent. And then there's also this card called Season's Pyromancer, which is a 3-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you discard 2 cards and then draw 2 cards. Where I like both of these cards is actually in a Living End deck. I think it might breathe new life in a different axis for Living End that goes more on the good stuff Living End rather than just trying to cycle everything immediately into the graveyard. So it gives another axis to where Living End can actually win if, for whatever reason, the graveyard is shut down. You can still just hard cast a bunch of these cards and just end up being an aggro-based deck. So if your opponents use a lot of resources into shutting down your graveyard or shutting down your ability for Living End, these type of cards are actually not that unreasonable. This puts 4 power into play for 3 mana. The Lightning Skelemental can do 6 damage right out the gates, and then it can set you up for even like Beast Withining your own lands and then attacking for lethal that way. You'd be surprised at how many Living End matches actually end up where you just start hard casting. They shut down your combo and you just start hard casting your cards, and they can actually get in there. So I'm actually liking these two for a living end deck. There are a lot of more implications for both these cards and a lot of just value off of like aristocrats type builds. However, this is the card that I think is poised to go up again. Every time this seems to be living end's trajectory. Look at this card. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. So it falls out of favor and it then gets back into favor, falls out of favor, gets back into favor. These valleys and mountains are very, very consistent with living end. So I think we're on another kind of valley. So I think the living end is poised to go back up in value regardless. And these two actually might be the ones that push it. So then we have the Astral Drift. Astral Drift is interesting with a cycle-based deck, but I actually like to pair it with an evoke and cycling-based deck. Speaking of living end, kind of works nicely with living end, or some of the other cards that you can, like the Cascade type effects. So the card I like with it is Mull Drifter. Mull Drifter gets printed every year in Commander. It probably will be in Commander 2019, but every time it gets reprinted, it goes up even slightly more. It seems like the demand from Pauper and Commander outstretch it, and now if this card actually can see play in a modern shell, and it's pretty powerful to evoke it and then cycle and flicker in some sort of you got to think like a Wall of Omens Mull Drifter flicker type shell where it has a lot of control based cards in it, just using counter spells, Path to Exiles, things like that to get to the late game, really grind out your opponent. I think the Astral Drift could be a good engine for that deck, and just cycling any card at that point then starts to at least get you 2 cards. There are other cards too that will work with this evoke or enter the battlefield type strategy, but I think this is the one that has the most synergy with the Astral Drift. So I'm liking Mull Drifter to possibly see a deck with it. It's definitely something you should keep your eye on. Other cards, of course, with evoke and edge of the battlefield in this list as well. Moving on to Spore Frog. Spore Frog is interesting if we get Tortured Existence, of course. That'll be a nice little pairing with the Spore Frog. But Mimic Vat, I don't think is too much of a stretch for the Spore Frog. So Spore Frog, this ends up being a fog on a stick. It could definitely be a way to shut down decks that just deal combat damage. And there are a few in the format right now. I would even put the Thing in the Ice and Arclight Phoenix deck in that mix. Now, that might be a stretch to get Mimic Vat attached to a Spore Frog, or Spore Frog get attached to Mimic Vat, but I don't know, it might not be that big of a stretch. It's three mana, and then you fog that turn, then it dies, it exiles under Mimic Vat, and then it's every turn it's just 3 more mana to indefinitely fog. Worship seen play before in Modern. I know this is a bit of a stretch. I know the Artifact Hate is there, but it could spawn some sort of rock variant Turbo Fog, Frog on a Stick, type Graveyard Recursion deck, and maybe that combo actually can see play. So keep your eye on Mimic Vat with the Spore Frog. Next up is the Scrapyard Recombiner. So Scrapyard Recombiner can go get many constructs. There are basically Hardened Scales Affinity is almost all constructs, so there's some good, if you actually read these comments here, there's some really good ones that can pair with it. But the one that I like with the price point right now is Hangerback Walker. Hangerback Walker's already on a bit of a downturn from its spike. I mean, this is very similar for cards that spike up from when you see these massive spikes, there usually is some price readjusting. But if you actually follow the trajectory of where it was normally going to where it should be, I think that Hangerback Walker is right around where it should be if you would have followed that normal, if you'd have taken this spike out of account and just let it naturally go up. So I think Hangerback Walker is going to increase anyways. And if this breathes new life in like a construct or a Hardened Scales Affinity type shell, then this card does pair very well with Hangerback Walker. I'm thinking that mainly it's rinse and repeat too with Hangerback Walkers. The more Hangerback Walker you pump it up to, the more times you can actually use the Scrapyard Recombiner. And so even looking at we haven't even talked about the implications. This is mainly focusing on Modern, but in Commander, that's a huge combo right there. All right, so on to the next one. This is the Planebound Accomplice. Planebound Accomplice has already found an infinite combo in the form of Cloudstone Curio. So Planebound Accomplice says you may put a Planeswalker card from your hand onto the battlefield and sacrifice at the beginning of next end step. So if you have Cloudstone Curio and 2 Chandra Torch of Defiances, it creates a loop, and then you have to have any infinite mana loop, and then you have to have something that you can do with the mana. So Cloudstone Curio is going to bounce your Chandra. Your Chandra is going to be able to be cheating to play for 1 red mana, then it's going to tick up for 2 red mana. which will allow you to cast your other Chandra, which will bounce your Chandra, and then your other Chandra will tick up too, and then rinse and repeat. So that's kind of the idea between the Planebound Accomplice and the Cloudstone Curio. Again, this is a bit of a stretch in Modern, but it still is one of those what-if scenarios, and they always do tend to cause a price increase. So keep your eye on Cloudstone Curio with the Sneak Attack Planeswalker, the Planebound Accomplice. So Chandra 2 is an honorable mention for the Planebound Accomplice. Next up, we have the Goblin Engineer. This one is, the price on this card is actually increasing very quickly. This combos with Trash for Treasure. Goblin Engineer is a 2 mana for a 1/2. You enters the battlefield and you search your library for an artifact card and put it in your graveyard. So it's kind of like a Buried Alive effect just on a Goblin Engineer. Then you can sacrifice an artifact to return an artifact for convert a mana cost 3 or less to your graveyard to the battlefield. This is not going to be useful probably to get back to your big bomb card that you're trying to recur from your graveyard, but it's going to help you cycle through like egg effects that will draw you a bunch of cards to then draw into the combo card. So the combo card is going to be Trash for Treasure, which is an additional cost to cast your Trash for Treasure. You sacrifice an artifact, and you can return an artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So there's cards like Mycosynth Lattice, there's Platinum Angel, there's Sundering Titan, there are plenty of back-breaking artifact cards that can be thrown from the graveyard onto the battlefield and really lock out the game. So those are the type of cards that you should be looking to pair with this. This is going to be like an Eggs shell. This is legal in Modern because it was printed in Mirrodin, and so all the pieces are now there for the Engineer. You can even find Ensnaring Bridges, just the toolbox Karn-based shell that we're seeing, prison-based decks that with Karn I think are actually going to want this combo. It seems viable enough, and having that 2 different ways to find your combos, one by tutoring it from your library and the other one from tutoring it from your sideboard with Karn, I think actually makes a pretty interesting deck. So I do think this one has the most likelihood of seeing play out of all the ones we've talked about so far for the Karn prison decks, and it's a decent little one to, get some value off of blocking it. And again, I actually like the second ability of just of cycling through your eggs until you find the right pieces, until you find your Karns, until you find your Trash for Treasures. And I'm pretty sure that there's other things you can do in this deck, like Indomitable Creativity. Maybe not powerful enough in Modern, but definitely worth a brew. And these combos will still see play in Commander regardless if they don't see play in Modern. Next up, we have Dregscape Sliver. Dregscape Sliver is interesting because it gives all slivers in your graveyard unearth. So basically what you need to do is just turn everything in your graveyard into slivers. So you got to think of things like we kind of have the Goryo's Vengeance shell with the Gristlebrand. I think that might be viable with Dregscape Sliver and this beautiful card called Ashes of the Fallen. Ashes of the Fallen says additional, as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. All the creatures in your graveyard are that type. So you name slivers, and then basically all of your creatures in your graveyard become slivers that you can then unearth. And therefore you can get back your Gristlebrand for 2 mana, which then has haste, and then it can do its thing. So not too much of a stretch for a deck like that to actually be able to see play in Modern. Again, it might be a janky, wonky sliver base or combo based deck that is just worse than Goryo's Vengeance, but it doesn't keep the Saffron Olives from brewing these decks and against the odds and causing price spikes because there was a fun interaction. This also is a nice interaction in Commander. Ashes of the Fallen are dirt cheap right now. They're only like 50 cents. From various vendors, and there's plenty of them out there. And what I like most about Ashes of the Fallen is it's from Saviors of Kamigawa. Talk about a low supply set. You can even target these foils, and I wouldn't fault you for that. So I think this one just gets better and better with the more cards printed. It's just a matter of time where Ashes of the Fallen becomes one of those low supply cards that gets broken in Commander or some sort of combo based deck. I've built decks around Ashes of the Fallen before that actually did pretty decent with Hakon. Casting Knights from your graveyard for infinite combos. I'll have to revisit that deck sometime, but the Sliver with Dregscape Sliver I think is a really good pairing for this card. The last card I have is a bit of a stretch too. This is called Fire Breath. Whenever it's battlefield, each opponent gains 10 life, but whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you put a verse counter on it, and then it deals damage equal number of verse counters to target player or planeswalker. Well, there's a free spell that does not allow your opponent to gain life. This is called Leyline of Punishment. So Lame Line of Punishment can come into play for free, and then you can get the Fire Breath, and then you just have to cast a few burn spells, and you basically just win the game. Or you can go the route of casting Manamorphose and a bunch of Storm-based cards for this to work as well. So Storm already is pretty good without this card, but it is a combo that I think people will try to brew around. You can see it's already has this little ticky up that is starting to move a little bit with Ley Line of Punishment. So there's Reign of Gore that actually does this as well. There's a few other cards that players can't gain life. I think it's a very reasonable combo to try to assemble between Fire Breath and Ley Line of Punishment. So there's a rundown of 10 cards that pair very well with Modern Horizons. Of course, more will come out, and we'll continue to take a look at these cards. All of these, though, regardless if they see play in Modern, I think are interesting for the Commander players and the casual players. So getting on these cards, I think they're all pretty safe. None of them all of them see play elsewhere. And most of these cards I've chosen are pretty low right now and haven't spiked up in price. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Kevin with the Rogue Market. Thanks for watching.